The four teenagers speed ahead on their motorcycles. The quiet breeze and chirping of the birds is only interrupted by the revving of their engines as they reach a bend in the road and birch trees part to reveal a beautiful bay. This is where they have planned to pitch their tent for the night, and with the sun high in the sky on this balmy summer day, they eagerly park their bikes near their campsite and begin to unpack. But what these teenagers don't realize is that in a matter of hours, 3 of their young lives will be horrifyingly cut short, and the serene shores of this beautiful lake will forever be tainted by a sinister past. Today, I will look at arguably the most notorious murder case in modern Finnish history. This story is known in English as the Lake Bodom Murders, and a number of other channels have already covered it, so I will do my best to add any further detail that I feel should be included. While the murders led to one of the most comprehensive investigations in Finnish history, the killer has never been identified, and the story still looms like a dark shadow over the beautiful countryside. But before I get started, if you haven't done so already, make sure to subscribe to my channel to make sure you don't miss any future episodes. It's the easiest way to support us, and I would be very grateful. Let's get on with today's story. Lake Bodom, and I apologize for my pronunciation of it, is a lake located near the Finnish city of Espoo, which itself is not far from the capital Helsinki. It measures approximately 3 kilometers in length and 1 kilometer in width, and it's a popular recreational area with ample opportunities for swimming and fishing and camping. Saturday, June 4th, 1960, is a hot summer day. 4 teenagers have decided to enjoy the weekend by camping out at the public beach near the village of Oittaa. They are Maila Björklund, who mainly goes by her middle name Irmeli, and Anja Tuliki Meki. They are both 15 years old, and they're joined by their boyfriends Seppo Antero Boisman and Nils Wilhelm Gustafsson, who are both 18. By all indications, the teens enjoy their afternoon drinking beer and smoking cigarettes before they finally retire to bed around 10:30 p.m. But sometime in the early morning hours on Sunday, June 5th, between 4 a.m. and 6 a.m., Irmeli, Anja, and Seppo are all stabbed and beaten to death. Nils is also attacked, but after suffering a number of fractured facial bones, he survives the ordeal, and he later recalls having seen a glimpse of a person wearing black clothes attacking them. At around 6 a.m., a group of boys who are all around 10 or 11 years old are out in the area to do some bird watching. At one point, they pass the outskirts of the campsite, and they claim to see a collapsed tent, but also a blonde man leaving the scene. Little do they realize that the bodies of the murdered teens are still inside the destroyed tent, and with no notion that something so horrific has unfolded only a short time earlier, the young boys move on. The bodies are finally discovered around 11 a.m. by a local carpenter named Esko Oiva Johansson, who had gone to the beach near the campsite to swim. Esko immediately alerts the authorities, and by noon, police have descended on the scene. Over the next few days, forensic experts try to paint a picture of what must have happened over the course of the night. It's eventually established that the killer has attacked the victims from outside the tent with a knife and an unidentified blunt object, possibly a rock. He has slashed at the sides of the tent, which is what likely caused it to collapse. These murder weapons have not been located. The killer has also taken a number of items, which puzzles the detectives. These include the keys to the motorcycles, which the victims had been driving, but the actual motorcycles have been left behind. Nils's leather shoes are discovered some 500 meters from the quiet campsite. They have been seemingly hidden in the shrubbery, but why is not immediately obvious. In later years, the cops have been criticized for some clear mistakes that were made during the handling of the crime scene. They failed to sufficiently close off the area, which soon enabled a lot of people to gain access to the campsite. And this meant that much of the area was trampled, and a lot of evidence was likely disturbed. The investigators had also seemingly failed to properly record the details of the scene. Authorities called in soldiers to help look for the missing items around the lake, including the knife that they figured had been used by the killer. But again, all this did was increase the foot traffic in and around the area. Now, let me remind you that this was in 1960. Forensic procedures were different back then, and so while human errors were clearly made, keep in mind that the Finnish police officers were likely facing a type of crime they rarely had to deal with. It's immediately obvious that Irmeli has suffered the most injuries out of the four teens. She has been stabbed multiple times even after her death, and her murder seems a lot more brutal than those of Anja and Seppo. Irmeli, who is the girlfriend of Nils, the only survivor, is also found undressed from the waist down, and she's actually discovered on top of the tent, which initially contradicts the observation made by the group of young boys who had walked by the scene earlier that day. Remember, they claim to have only seen the collapsed tent, and surely they would have noticed if there was a dead person on top of it. When Esko discovers the bodies, Nils, who is indeed badly injured, is still clinging on to life, and he's also laying outside the tent. Again, does this mean that the bodies of Nils and Irmeli had been moved sometime between 6 a.m. when the boys who were birdwatching walked by and 11 a.m. when the bodies were found? Or did those young boys simply fail to spot them? This is one of the things that has remained a mystery to this day, and it's also a fact that will later add quite a bit of complexity to the case. When a murder case goes unsolved for over 60 years, a number of theories are bound to materialize over time, and the case of the Lake Bodom Murders is no different. After the killings, many locals quickly suspected a man named Karl Guldström. Karl had a convenience store in the nearby village of Oittaa, and he had been known to be hostile towards campers and children. Apparently, a number of people claimed that Karl would eventually confess to the murders on a number of occasions, but the authorities remained skeptical of this because they considered him mentally unwell. There have been several instances in the past of Karl knocking over tents and throwing rocks at strangers on his street, and some locals even claimed that they witnessed Karl returning to his home from the direction of the crime scene in the early hours of the morning on the day of the murders. But because they had been too scared of him, this had not been reported to the cops initially. Karl's wife also provided an alibi for him. She claimed that he had been in bed with her all night, but sometime later, she would go on to retract this, as she claimed that Karl had threatened to kill her if he in any way implicated him in the murders. Eerily, Karl would later on drunkenly tell a friend that he indeed was the killer. Him and this friend had been drinking one day in 1969, and Karl had been very intoxicated. But the friend Börje didn't at first believe him. Karl, however, had seemed somber, and he had asked Börje what he thought he should do if he really was the murderer. Börje had told him, in that case, he should go drown himself in the lake, because if he really was the killer, he would need to spend the rest of his life in prison. And only a couple of hours later, Karl had staggered over to the banks of Lake Bodom, where he had proceeded to in fact drown himself. It's at least believed to have been a suicide. The cops, however, have never found any hard proof linking Karl Guldström to the crimes, so the many suspicions of him being the real killer largely died with him that day. In the mid-60s, another individual would go on to claim that he was responsible for the murders. Pentti, who was already known to the authorities for his violent tendencies, supposedly confessed to another inmate while in jail that he was the real killer of the 14s back in 1960. But this theory has not been given much consideration over the years. At the time of the murders, Pentti would have been only 14 years old, and most people agreed it was unlikely that someone so young could have actually overpowered four other teenagers, a couple of whom were muscular boys 4 years his senior. In a bizarre twist of fate, however, he eventually decided to commit suicide just like Karl Guldström had done. And oddly, he did this in the same year as Karl, in 1969. But this brings us to a third suspect, and this has been perhaps one of the more popularized theories to this day. On June 6, 1960, so the day after the bodies are discovered, a man stumbles into an emergency room in Helsinki. Hans Asman is a German-born naturalized Finnish citizen, and at the time of the murders, he lives only a couple of kilometers from Lake Bodom. At the hospital, Hans acts increasingly erratic. His clothes are bloody and his nails are dirty, and when he speaks, his sentences are incoherent. While he's waiting for his turn in the ER, he at one point pretends to be unconscious in order to be seen faster. But when this doesn't work, he starts to get angry, and eventually he's asked by the staff to leave. Hans had actually been a person of interest in a number of murder cases in the past, and when the cops start to look at him as a potential suspect, the young boys who had been birdwatching near the campsite soon identify him as the man they witnessed leaving the scene. It turns out that Hans had thick wavy blonde hair at the time of the killings, and when this description of the suspect is reported in the media, he quickly shaves his head bald. Of course, this could simply be circumstantial, but it obviously didn't make the authorities less suspicious of him. And the clothes that Hans had on when he visited the hospital in Helsinki that morning also seemed to more or less match the description given by the boys. And soon, a detail that was noticed would increase the suspicion of Hans Assmann as the murderer significantly. When Nils, the only survivor of the attack, is initially questioned, he is actually put under some sort of hypnosis in order for him to remember some more details from the assault. This also enables him to better recollect what the assailant had looked like, and from his description of the person, an artist is able to create a composite sketch of the attacker. When the cops have this sketch in their hands, they start to compare it to photos of anyone they believed could be linked to the crimes. Eventually, they also look at pictures taken while they explored the area after the discovery of the bodies. It's not unheard of for killers to return to the scene of their crimes, so is it possible that the murderer was hiding in the background of one of these photos? At some point, one of the detectives glances at a picture from one of the funerals of the victims, and immediately a person stands out to him. Among the people in the picture, a man is seen in the background who looks a lot like the person in the sketch produced from Nils' memory. This man has pale skin and dark sunken eyes, and immediately it becomes clear that he in fact looks a lot like Hans Assmann as well. A number of locals later noted that Hans' behavior in the aftermath of the crimes seemed very suspicious for a while, but as had been the case with the other suspects, Karl and Pentti, the cops just didn't have any material evidence that incriminated Hans Assmann in the murders, and eventually their interest in him faded. And some people would even testify that Hans hadn't actually been at the funeral when the infamous picture had been taken. He later moved to Sweden, where he lived the rest of his life and died in the late 1990s. But over the years, Hans Assmann oddly featured as a suspect in 5 other murder cases, and on his deathbed, he supposedly even confessed to one of them. Eventually, the investigations of the killings stagnated. When a murder isn't solved within a couple of months, it becomes increasingly unlikely that it ever will be. In this case, the families of the 3 murdered teens eventually had to come to grips with the reality that they may never find out what really happened that day in 1960. But in late March 2004, almost 44 years after the horrific murders, the story takes a sudden and dramatic turn. Nils Gustafsson, the sole survivor of the brutal attack, is arrested. The Finnish authorities boldly declare that the case has been solved based on modern forensic analysis. The prosecutors have reached the belief that because Nils had been drinking heavily over the course of the day, he had eventually been so intoxicated that the others had asked him to leave their tent. Supposedly, this led to Nils attacking the other boy, Seppo, suffering a number of broken facial bones in the process. But this altercation had soon escalated, which eventually resulted in Nils killing all 3 of his friends. But what led the authorities to suddenly be so sure in their case this many years later? Nils Gustafsson's trial starts on August 4th, 2005. The defense immediately argues that the murders had to have been the act of more than one outsider. They argue that Nils had been incapable of killing 3 people given the extent of his injuries. The prosecutors, however, quickly focus on a very particular detail: Nils Gustafsson's shoes. If you remember, I mentioned that they had been found discarded in the shrubbery about 500 meters from the scene, while Nils himself had been found barefoot outside the tent. Modern DNA processing had played a major part in the prosecutor's case, as it determined that the blood from all 3 deceased teens was indeed present on the shoes, but there was no sign of any blood from Nils. They argued that this fact suggested his injuries had occurred at a different time than the time of the attack on his friends, The prosecutors believed the only possible explanation was that Nils had in fact committed the murders himself, then faked the theft of several items by discarding them, after which he had further injured himself and returned to the tent where he pretended to be unconscious. They also argued that the blonde man that was seen by the boys who had been out birdwatching on the morning of the discovery had really been Nils in the midst of rearranging the crime scene. Over the last 40 years, Nils Gustafsson had gone on to live a normal life. He had married and had a couple of kids, and by the time of his trial, he had even retired from work. And when he was arrested, he reiterated what he had claimed for all those years, that he could not remember what happened on that gruesome night back in 1960. The prosecutors, however, reaffirmed their theory that Nils had tried to orchestrate the crime scene in a way that made it look like they had been attacked by a crazed madman and that he had removed Irmeli's pants to make it appear as if she had been sexually assaulted. Interestingly, after all the years that had passed, the authorities had actually managed to find another witness. A local woman had been camping near the 14s with some of her friends around the time of the murders, and she didn't tell anyone about this until much later. She claimed that Nils and the other boy who had been murdered, Seppo, had visited her tent sometime after dark. Nils had supposedly been very drunk, and he had acted aggressively. Of course, this didn't add further proof of Nils' culpability, but it's obvious that the prosecutors tried to paint a very different picture of Nils than that of yet another victim. The defense, however, pointed to the traces of Nils' blood that had been found inside the tent, as proof that he had been inside of it himself when the killer had slashed at it with a knife. They also pointed out that Nils did indeed share some clear memories of arriving at the lake on Saturday, but did not remember visiting another tent, which Irmeli also hadn't mentioned in her diary which had been found at the crime scene. And finally, they argued, Nils simply didn't possess a motive for committing such horrific crimes against his closest friends. If the prosecutors had to point at a motive, it was that Nils could have possibly erupted in some sort of angry tantrum over an altercation with his girlfriend. But they couldn't explain what could have made him so incensed that he had decided to end their lives. They repeated their belief that Nils had hurt himself in order to back up his story of someone else attacking them. They also focused on the fact that Irmeli had suffered more injuries than Seppo and Anja. Sometimes this suggests that a specific murder victim somehow matters more to the killer. And remember, Irmeli had been Nils' girlfriend, but in the end, the additional facts gathered over the years that seemed to point at Nils as the attacker remained largely circumstantial. And as long as that is the case, identifying any one individual as the person behind the horrifying murders at Lake Bodom will remain an uphill battle. On October 7th, 2005, Nils was acquitted of all charges. The court explained that the facts represented by the prosecutors had simply been too inconclusive. They also didn't feel satisfied that a compelling motive for such horrific crimes had been established, and the accuracy of much of the details recorded when the bodies had been discovered were also considered questionable due to the many years that had passed. Nils was paid almost 45,000 euros by the Finnish government to compensate him for the mental suffering he had endured during the trial, and it was considered whether or not the public prosecutors needed to file charges against the media for defamation. But in the end, they decided not to, and Nils also declined to pursue a civil suit himself. Nils Gustafsson's trial remains the last attempt at fully solving the Lake Bodom murders, and given the fact that it has been almost 65 years since that fateful summer night, it honestly seems more likely than not that the public will never find out who really killed those teenagers. For over 60 years, parents in southern Finland have cautioned their kids to be on their best behavior. If not, they too could fall victim to the boogeyman that still haunts the shores of Lake Bodom. The story almost has the feeling of an urban legend at this point. But while most urban legends are pure fantasy, this boogeyman was real. At least, he was back in 1960. Then again, who knows? Of course, it's always possible that there is a phantom killer out there, ready to find another fresh-faced teenager, enjoying the summer near the shores of the beautiful lake. This is it for today's story. The Lake Bodom Murders is a dark and horrifying case, and it probably remains the country's most famous series of homicides. If you have other similar stories in mind from around the Nordic countries, feel free to share them in the comments, and I may take a look at them in the future. If you haven't done so already, make sure to subscribe to my channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss any upcoming episodes. I will be back in 2 weeks with another case. Thank you for watching.